Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson was driving late one night outside Birmingham, Alabama, the hum of her car's engine blending with the soft rhythm of an old jazz tune playing through the speakers. The road was nearly empty, the streetlights flickering as they cast long shadows over the wet pavement. It was just past 11 p.m., the kind of hour where most people were eager to get home. Renee had been driving for nearly 2 hours, her fingers drumming lightly against the steering wheel as she hummed along to the music. She wasn't in uniform, just a simple black sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back into a neat bun. She didn't stand out, or so she thought. But when the flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror, her stomach clenched. It wasn't fear that gripped her. It was exhaustion. She knew how these things could go. Renee signaled, changed lanes, and eased her car onto the shoulder. She put the car in park, took a slow breath, and kept both hands on the wheel where they could be seen. She had been in the military long enough to know the drill. A white patrol car stopped just behind her, and the officer took his time getting out. When he finally did, he moved with the swagger of a man who expected obedience. His heavy boots scuffed against the asphalt, one hand resting on his belt, the other holding a flashlight that flicked on as he approached. Renee turned her head slightly, watching him through the side mirror. The name on his badge caught the light. Briggs. License and registration, he demanded, his voice flat and impatient. There was no greeting, no explanation. Renee met his eyes in the mirror, then reached slowly into the glove compartment to retrieve her documents. "Was I speeding, officer?" she asked, her voice steady. Briggs didn't answer right away. He took the papers from her hand, holding them just out of reach as he gave her car a once-over. "Taillights out," he said finally. Renee frowned. That can't be right. They were checked a few weeks ago. Briggs finally looked at her, his expression hardening. "Are you arguing with me?" A beat of silence passed, and Renee could feel the shift in the air, that quiet, unspoken moment where power met resistance, and one side expected the other to cave. Renee knew better than to push, but she also knew her rights. "I'm just saying," she replied, her voice calm. "My taillights were checked recently, but if there's an issue, I can get it fixed." Briggs cut her off. "Step out of the car." His tone left no room for negotiation. Renee exhaled slowly, her mind racing. She glanced toward the traffic ahead. No witnesses. She tapped her fingers against the steering wheel once, then reached for the door handle. "Mind telling me why?" she asked. Briggs tilted his head, smirking. "Because I said so." She let it hang in the air for a second, then unbuckled her seatbelt and pushed the door open. The night air was cooler than she expected, and it sent a slight shiver down her spine as she stepped onto the pavement. Her posture was relaxed but measured. She wasn't looking for a fight, but she wouldn't be bullied either. Briggs took a step back, scanning her. She could feel him sizing her up, deciding how much he could get away with. "Turn around." "Hands on the car," he ordered. This time, she hesitated. For what reason? Briggs took a step closer, his smirk disappearing. "Are you resisting?" Renee held her ground. "No, I'm asking a question." A flicker of something crossed his face, annoyance, amusement, maybe both. Then, without warning, he reached for his radio. "We got a non-compliant driver here," he muttered into speaker. Then louder, "Turn around." Renee's pulse picked up, but her expression stayed neutral. "Officer, I need you to understand something," she said, her voice low but firm. "I know exactly what I'm allowed to do, and I know exactly what you can't do." Briggs didn't like that. His jaw tensed, and he snapped, "You're under arrest," reaching for her wrist. Renee moved before he could grab her, stepping back just enough to avoid his grip. "Under arrest for what?" she asked. "For obstructing an officer," Briggs replied, pulling out his cuffs. Renee exhaled sharply through her nose. So that was his game. Her military training kicked in, heartbeat steady, breathing even. She knew she had two choices: comply and fight this later, or push back and risk escalation. She wasn't about to become another statistic. With slow, deliberate movements, she turned, placed her hands on the roof of her car. The metal was cool against her palms. Briggs wasted no time yanking her arms behind her back, tightening the cuffs far more than necessary before shoving her toward the patrol car. "You don't know what you're doing," she murmured. Briggs chuckled. "Lady, I know exactly what I'm doing." But he didn't, not even close. The hard plastic seat of the patrol car dug into Renee's back as Briggs drove her to the station. She sat still, her wrists burning against the cuffs, her breath measured. The door slammed shut behind her, sealing her in. Outside, Briggs strutted back to his vehicle, muttering something into his radio. Renee glanced at the partition separating her from the front seat, the faint reflection of her face staring back, calm, composed. But beneath that, something simmered. She had been through combat drills, high-stakes operations, and interrogations in foreign territories. But this was different. This was a man with a badge, drunk on power, convinced he was untouchable. At the station, Briggs led her through booking, fingerprints, mug shot, the whole routine. The officers behind the desk barely looked up, just going through the motions. Renee had seen this kind of indifference before. It was the kind that let bad men like Briggs thrive. When it was over, he grabbed her wrist again, leading her toward the cells. "You think you're smart, huh?" he muttered under his breath. Renee glanced sideways. "I don't have to think." His grip tightened. He didn't like that. "Enjoy your stay," Briggs sneered, shoving her toward the cell. Renee caught herself before she stumbled, watching as the metal bars slid shut between them. Briggs smirked from the other side, tapping the bars lightly with his fingers before walking away. The lock clicked into place. Renee took a slow breath, then sank onto the bench. The chill of the metal pressed through her jeans, grounding her. One night, she thought, that's all it would take. Because Briggs had no idea who he had just messed with. She closed her eyes, her mind already working through the next steps. She had connections, powerful ones. And by morning, the truth would come to light. The next day, Renee stood in court, her posture as composed as it had been during the traffic stop. The body cam footage played on a screen, exposing Briggs's unnecessary escalation and misconduct. The prosecutor highlighted Renee's distinguished military record and pointed out Briggs's history of racial profiling. The judge dismissed the charges against Renee and called for an internal investigation into Briggs's conduct. The once confident officer was left stunned as his career began to unravel. Renee's victory was more than personal. It was a blow against systemic injustice. As she left the courtroom, she knew the fight was far from over. But for now, she had won. And Briggs? He was about to learn that power unchecked is power abused, and that no one is untouchable. The next morning, the courthouse buzzed with an air of anticipation as the case of Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson versus Sergeant Daniel Briggs unfolded. The courtroom was packed, with reporters, officers, and curious onlookers filling the benches. Renee stood near the defendant's table, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp. She wasn't in handcuffs or an orange jumpsuit. Instead, she wore a well-tailored navy blue blazer and a simple blouse, her presence commanding respect. Beside her, her attorney, Carla Whitman, flipped through a stack of papers with the efficiency of someone who had seen it all before. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with neatly combed hair, cleared his throat and began presenting the case. The body cam footage was the centerpiece of the prosecution's argument. As the screen lowered at the front of the courtroom, the video began to play. It showed Briggs approaching Renee's car with an air of arrogance, his voice flat and impatient as he demanded her license and registration. The footage captured Renee's calm and measured responses, her polite questioning of his claims about her taillights, and Briggs's immediate escalation. The courtroom watched in silence as Briggs ordered her out of the car, tightened the cuffs unnecessarily, and shoved her into the back of his patrol car. The video ended with Briggs muttering into his radio, "We got a non-compliant driver here," his tone dripping with disdain. The prosecutor paused the footage and turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this footage clearly shows that Sergeant Briggs violated protocol. Lieutenant Commander Dawson was cooperative and respectful throughout the encounter. There was no justification for her arrest, let alone the excessive use of force." He then highlighted Renee's distinguished military record, presenting documents that showed her graduation from a naval academy, her multiple commendations, and her spotless criminal history. This is not the profile of someone who would resist a lawful order. The prosecutor stated firmly, Sergeant Briggs's actions were not only unnecessary, but also indicative of a broader pattern of misconduct. The defense attorney, a wiry man with a nervous demeanor, attempted to counter the prosecution's arguments. He claimed that Briggs had acted within his discretion as an officer, and that Renee's questioning of his authority had justified the arrest. But his arguments fell flat under the weight of the evidence. The prosecutor then presented a damning report. An internal review of Briggs's arrest history showed a disproportionate number of traffic stops involving black drivers in his district. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as the prosecutor pointed out that Briggs had been the subject of multiple complaints in the past, though none had resulted in disciplinary action. Judge Alan Kirkland, an older man with a weary expression, adjusted his glasses as he reviewed the case files. He didn't waste time. "Sergeant Briggs," he said, his voice firm, "care to explain your actions?" Briggs leaned forward, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative during a routine traffic stop. I was following standard procedure." The prosecutor cut him off. "Uncooperative? The footage shows otherwise. Lieutenant Commander Dawson's record speaks for itself. Are you telling me that despite all this, she was such a threat that you had to arrest her over a broken taillight?" Briggs opened his mouth to respond but found no words. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Judge Kirkland set his file down with a sigh. "Sergeant Briggs, I don't like what I'm hearing. You violated protocol, conducted an unlawful arrest, and failed to report the full details in your initial statement. The charges against Lieutenant Commander Dawson are hereby dismissed." His gavel came down with a sharp, final thud. "Furthermore, I strongly suggest an internal investigation into Sergeant Briggs's conduct." The tension in the room snapped like a pulled rubber band. Briggs looked like he had been punched in the gut. His face flushed red, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Renee simply exhaled slowly, her expression calm and composed. She had never doubted the outcome. As the courtroom emptied, Briggs stormed out, his heavy footsteps echoing down the polished hallways. He could feel the eyes on him. Other officers, court staff, even reporters who had shown up after word the case spread. He wasn't used to this. He was used to control, to walking into a room and commanding respect or fear. But now, the power he had taken for granted felt like it was slipping through his fingers. He turned a corner and nearly collided with Chief Eldon Baker, a respected figure in the department with over 30 years on the force. Baker's expression was unreadable, but his tone was sharp. "What the hell were you thinking?" he demanded, motioning for Briggs to follow him into a private office. The second the door shut, Baker's tone dropped. "This wasn't some random woman, Briggs. This was a high-ranking Navy officer. You think this is just going to disappear?" Briggs exhaled sharply, his face burning. "She was disrespectful. She questioned me." Baker scoffed. "That's not a crime. The DA is reviewing every single one of your cases from the past 5 years. You've been flagged for racial profiling, and you better believe this department isn't going down with you." Briggs felt his stomach twist. "What does that mean?" Baker straightened. "It means you're being put on immediate suspension, effective now. Internal Affairs is investigating, and if they find what I think they're going to find, your career is over." Briggs stood there, his world unraveling in real time. For the first time in his career, he realized he wasn't untouchable. He thought back to the traffic stop, to the way Renee had looked at him with that quiet confidence, as if she knew something he didn't. He had underestimated her, and now he was paying the price. As he packed up his desk later that day, the weight of his actions settled heavily on his shoulders. The department had turned its back on him, and the public scrutiny was only beginning. Reporters were already digging into his past, and the calls for reform were growing louder. Briggs had always believed his badge gave him the right to act with impunity, but now he was facing the consequences of his arrogance. Renee, meanwhile, sat in a quiet cafe, stirring a cup of coffee as she scrolled through her phone. The case had made headlines, and the footage had gone viral. People were calling for reform, for accountability, for change. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from her attorney. Briggs had been suspended, and there was a possibility he could face criminal charges. Renee took a slow sip of her coffee, her expression thoughtful. She knew this wasn't just about her. It was about the countless others who had faced similar injustices but didn't have the resources or voice to fight back. Briggs was part of a larger problem, one that allowed officers like him to operate unchecked. Her victory was a step toward change, but the fight was far from over. As she walked through the city, Renee thought about the next generation, the young black boys and girls who deserved to grow up in a world where power wasn't abused. She had fought not just for herself, but for them. The mayor's office had reached out, wanting to recognize her for her professionalism and grace, but Renee wasn't sure she wanted the spotlight. She knew the real victory was in the conversation her case had sparked. Power unchecked is power abused, and the only way to change the system is to hold accountable. Renee's story was a reminder that real change starts with real conversations, and she was determined to keep pushing forward. The crisp afternoon air carried the scent of fresh rain as Renee stepped out of the cafe. She walked with the same confidence she always had, her head high and her step steady. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from her commanding officer. The Department of Defense had taken an interest in her case, and there was talk of her speaking on it publicly. Renee sighed, knowing that her fight was about to take on a much larger stage. She wasn't just a Navy officer anymore. She was a symbol of resistance, a voice for those who had been silenced. As she ended the call, she glanced at her reflection in a nearby storefront window. She saw no signs of defeat, no cracks in her composure. She had stayed firm, and now she had won. But the fight wasn't over. Not for her, and not for the countless others who deserved justice. Renee took a deep breath and walked away, her steps firm and her purpose clear. This was just the beginning. Renee's victory in the courtroom was a significant step toward accountability. But as she sat in the quiet cafe, stirring her coffee, she knew the fight was far from over. The dismissal of the charges against her and the exposure of Sergeant Briggs's misconduct were important wins, but they were just the beginning. Renee's mind wandered to the countless others who had faced similar injustices, people who didn't have the resources, the connections, or the platform to fight back. She thought about the young black men and women who had been stopped, harassed, or worse, simply because of the color of their skin. She thought about the mothers who had lost their children to police brutality, the families torn apart by a system that too often protected its own at the expense of justice. Her case had sparked a conversation, but conversations alone weren't enough. Real change required action, and Renee was determined to be part of that change. As she scrolled through her phone, she saw the headlines. Navy officer wrongfully arrested, body cam footage exposes police misconduct, calls for reform grow louder. The footage of her arrest had gone viral, and people were demanding accountability. Social media was flooded with hashtags and stories from others who had experienced similar treatment at the hands of law enforcement. Renee's case had become a rallying cry, a symbol of the systemic issues that had plagued communities for generations. But she knew that symbols weren't enough. Symbols could inspire, but they couldn't dismantle the structures that allowed men like Briggs to operate with impunity. Renee's victory was a step, but the road ahead was long and fraught with challenges. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from her attorney. Briggs had been suspended, and there was a possibility he could face criminal charges. Renee took a slow sip of her coffee, her expression thoughtful. She knew this wasn't just about Briggs. It was about the system that had enabled him. The internal investigation into his conduct was a start, but it wasn't enough. Renee thought about the other officers who had turned a blind eye to Briggs's behavior, the supervisors who had ignored complaints, the policies that prioritized protecting the department over protecting the people it served. Accountability had to go beyond one bad actor. It had to address the culture that allowed such behavior to flourish. As she walked through the city, Renee thought about the next generation, the young black boys and girls who deserved to grow up in a world where power wasn't abused. She had fought not just for herself, but for them. The mayor's office had reached out, wanting to recognize her for her professionalism and grace, but Renee wasn't sure she wanted the spotlight. She knew the real victory was in the conversation her case had sparked. Power unchecked is power abused, and the only way to change the system is to hold it accountable. Renee's story was a reminder that real change starts with real conversations, and she was determined to keep pushing forward. The crisp afternoon air carried the scent of fresh rain as Renee stepped out of the cafe. She walked with the same confidence she always had, her head high and her steps steady. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from her commanding officer. The Department of Defense had taken an interest in her case, and there was talk of her speaking on it publicly. Renee sighed, knowing that her fight was about to take on a much larger stage. She wasn't just a Navy officer anymore. She was a symbol of resistance, a voice for those who had been silenced. As she ended the call, she glanced at her reflection in a nearby storefront window. She saw no signs of defeat, no cracks in her composure. She had stayed firm, and now she had won. But the fight wasn't over, not for her, and not for the countless others who deserved justice. Renee took a deep breath and walked away, her steps firm and her purpose clear. She knew that her victory was just one battle in a much larger war. The system was deeply entrenched, and change wouldn't come overnight. But Renee was ready for the long haul. She had fought not just for herself, but for the next generation, ensuring that men like Briggs could no longer wield their badges as weapons. She had fought for a world where power was held accountable, where justice wasn't just a privilege for the few, but a right for all. And as she walked through the city, her head held high, she knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice, for equality, for a better future. It was a fight worth fighting, and Renee was ready to lead the charge.